Hi there, thanks for watching this video on professional SQL source code control. It may sound a bit odd to have a topic that's kind of old, but I've recently learned some new tips and tricks that I want to kind of share because I haven't seen it put together in quite this way just yet. So let's talk first about what we're trying to fix. So the background around what we're trying to do is that SQL developers are used to making changes directly in SQL Management Studio. I'm completely guilty of this. It's very easy to open up SSMS, go to a stored procedure, modify it, add a few lines of code, tweak a join, tweak a query, hit execute, and boom, it's all done. And you can kind of run it. You get it's a natural and it's a normal use case and development experience, and it's okay. But it's got the benefits of that. It's familiar. It's got some tight feedback loops. You can kind of run things and see the changes right away. There's usually not too many objects that are changed. You're typically working on a handful of tables, views, or stored procedures. And all of those objects can be scripted for change control. So if they need to go through, get passed to someone else for deployment in test or prod, that's fine. But there's some risks to that. The changes can collide with other team members. So let's say you're working on one stored procedure and it uses a table. Someone else is using that same table. Maybe they've added a few fields to it, but you don't know about that. Those things, if you promote them at the wrong time, can have pretty disastrous consequences, because changing the data tier of any application can be a high risk change. And also comparing prod to dev can be challenging. If you're just going to do it maybe on 2 objects, not too difficult. You can decide, put them, use your favorite diff tool, line them up, and you're fine. But once you start getting into tens of objects or hundreds of objects, it's very difficult to do that manually. It's hard to test without affecting the data. So in dev, if we need to add a new order, add a new product, add a new customer, to test those features and functionality, we can do that. But if we're doing it in test or doing it in prod, it's a bit more risky to do so. Other folks could be doing other activities. The other thing to think about is source code control is expected at enterprise levels. So if we're building a small web app used by 10 people, sure, fill your boots. But if it's something that we're building, there's going to be thousands of users, and it's a banking application or it's a financial application, source code control is really expected at this point. Most other languages take it for granted that all teams use source code control. And compliance without source code control is near impossible. So if someone comes to say, when were these changes happened? Or when were these changes done? Who made them? What were they? What was the change control around them? Without some kind of source code control, those are very difficult questions to answer. And fires. So we've all had the experience, someone calls, hey, something's broken. So when something breaks or performance sucks, it's very hard to trace back through recent changes to find a root cause without some kind of source code control. When you ask a team, hey, did you make any changes recently? They're always going to say no. And in their defense, it could be a change that they didn't know that they made, or it could be a change that, hey, it happened from some external factor they just don't know about. And even with source code control, it can be a manual effort to identify what change had unintended consequences. Maybe it's not all the change that needs to be rolled back, but something very specific to a view or stored procedure or a linked server or a number of things. So I'm going to try and convince you that using this approach, we can address a lot of these challenges. And I want to call it kind of old is new. So the database project solution in Visual Studio, and that I'm going to be specific to Visual Studio, this is not available in VS Code, is not new. GitHub is not new. Source code control is not new. The combination of them is not even new. But I don't think enough of us use these together. So that's really what I'm going to get at with this video. Use cases, why should I care? Well, when a client comes to you and says the system is broken, this will help you look like a rock star to quickly identify exactly what changed and roll it back. Before promoting that one small change to a stored procedure, this will regression test the whole database to make sure we didn't break things. Even if the database is performing great, this approach will almost always identify inconsistencies and bugs, in SQL that should be fixed to minimize risk. And how are we going to do it? Well, we're going to walk through creating a Visual Studio solution with a database project, importing a database, running the build function on that database, and this is the part that will identify bugs, errors, and inconsistencies. And then we're going to push that to a repository as a baseline. We're going to make a few changes in SSMS, and that's to simulate someone else on the team making a change that they didn't tell anyone about. And we're going to compare the database project to the real database. We're going to review and push those changes into GitHub. So let's, as the guy in the cube or gal in the cube says, let's go to my machine. So when you open up Visual Studio, I'm using 2022. You have the option to create a new project. So we can create a new project. It's going to give you a list of all the different templates. I typically search for data. And look at that. The SQL Server database project goes right to the top. That's the template we're going to use. I'm going to click Next. It's going to ask me to configure my project. I'm going to say this is my YouTube project demo 1. I've already got it set, so it's going to put it in my Git folder. You don't need to put it in the same place, but that's just something I do to keep my repositories clean. Here we go. Now we're into the project. It doesn't look great at the moment. It's pretty empty. And now we kind of see we've got our solution. This top line here is the name of the solution. And to take a step back, Visual Studio uses the concept of a solution that can have multiple projects. In this case, the solution is a database. It's kind of an empty solution, but we're using a database project as the project within that solution. So we don't really have anything set up right now, but if I right click on my solution, I can now import a database. So let's do that. And here I can select the databases that I want to import, or database I want to import. So I'm going to connect to my local machine here. And so it's my local machine, so I use the dot to say, hey, just connect in. What's the database I want to use? I have to make sure I trust that. The database I'm going to use AdventureWorks. There we go. So now a lot of my target stuff is grayed out for now, but we'll come back to that in a bit. I'm just going to leave everything as a default and just hit start. Now it's importing that database schema. So it's going through and grabbing all the objects it can find. And you'll see over on the right-hand side, it's populating kind of a folder structure to represent all the different bits and pieces within this database. It doesn't take too long because it's just looking at scripts. So now when I click Finish, now over in my solution, in my project, I see a number of different bits and pieces in here. So I get a folder first by schema, then I've got functions, stored procedures, tables, and I can look at the actual table structures. Notice when I click on these things, I get a designer if I want to play with the designer, or I have the SQL that I see down there as well. Let's look at stored procedures. So here I've got my bill of materials, stored procedure here. This looks good. So I've just pulled this in. This is not in source control yet. This is not in GitHub. So how do I get this into GitHub? Well, what I can do is in Visual Studio, there is a Git menu that shows up. So I'm going to say I'm going to create a Git repository. And it already knows where I'm working. And you may need to be prompted to log into GitHub. So if you're logging into GitHub, you can choose whether this is going to be private, public, or internal. I'm going to set this one as private, and I can say create and push. I have to save my changes. Yep, save my changes. That's fine. Let that spin for a moment. Now that I let that spin, if I look in my GitHub repository, I see that it's automatically been created and it's already been populated with all the objects that are here. And it just says add project file. So it's just kind of done that initial push of all the different objects directly into that repository. So that's nice to see. Now, going back to our list here. So one thing we wanted to do is we wanted to create the Visual Studio solution with the database project. We've done that. We imported our database. The next is run the build function. So this is a piece that it may sound a bit odd. What do I mean build? So here I am. I'm over on. If I go right-click on my solution, I do have an option to build my database project. Now, building a database project may sound odd. Like, what are you really building? It's just looking for inconsistencies. So it would go through, and we can demonstrate this for a moment. Let's say, let's do it. We'll go and make a change, and we'll demonstrate the compare as well. So now let's flip over to, let's pretend we've got a team member over in SQL Server Management Studio. Let's make a change. Let's flip over there. So here we are. We're using SQL Server Management Studio now. We're connected to the same database, and we're going to look at that same stored procedure we happen to have open, this get bill of materials. So if I come in here and I modify this, and let's say I come in and I'm just going to add a comment just for as an example here. So I'll say this is some comment that someone added but didn't tell anyone about. And then they execute it. Boom, all done. Okay, and that's fine. So now if we flip back to Visual Studio, it's not updated in the file that I have open. It's over in the database. There's no way to know what's going on. But what if we were to do a compare? So now you may be wondering, where is the schema compare tool? I find it's very hidden within this user interface. So that's why I'm going to call it exactly where it is. You have to right click on the solution, and then you see the schema compare tool as the third option down. When you go into the schema compare tool, you get this interesting UI where you can start comparing different locations, different environments. So by default, on the left-hand side, I've got my local files. So this is the files on my local machine that I'm working with. I can select my target. Well, I want to select that database I'm looking at. So if I pick AdventureWorks, and I list that in, now the only option I have in the menu right now is to compare. So when I run that compare, it's doing exactly what you may think it's doing. It's going to go and compare all the objects that I have on in my workspace with the objects that are actually on the server at the moment. Now, as it's nice to see, well, they're all the same except for one. So here I can see exactly what the differences are. So imagine that someone else has I've worked on maybe one stored procedure myself, or one view or table, and I run this compare of the files that I'm working on in the database, or at least in the repository, and I see, oh, wait a minute, there's some changes that someone else has here in that same stored procedure I was looking at. So we can prevent this from going into production with maybe some unintended consequences or changes that might not be ready. But in this case, it's just a comment. It's not a big deal. So we can just click on the update button. And what is the update? Are you sure you want to update the target? Actually, I don't. So this is where the left is the source and the right is the target. So I actually want to switch these. So by just switching those, now when I update, I'll run that compare one more time. There we go. So it's over in the database, but it's not in my local files. So go ahead and update. Sure you want to update the target? Yeah, I want to update the target. There we go. And now I can even run this compare a fresh one. Oh, and everything's in sync. So now if I look at my local machine now, local one, I'll see that there's a check mark on this one. And I open it, I see that comment because the local file that I had on my machine has now been updated from what was on that server. And with the Git integration, I should be able to push this right into GitHub. not a huge fan of the UI for this, but I'll show you where it is. So I can click on really a lot of these items here. I'll get a Git submenu and I can say commit. It's going to flip over to a Git changes toolbar control here. And I have to type in a message. So new comment added for testing. And I can say commit all. And then it's created locally. So now that commit is done locally here on my machine. And I can push that change up to, there we go. And now that's been pushed into the branch that I was on. We can get into more stuff around changing branches. So you can play with different branches if you want to do that. But what I want to what I wanted to demonstrate here today is really that we used the Visual Studio solution with a database project. We imported a database. We ran the build function to identify if there's any errors. We pushed the repository as a baseline, made a change in SSMS. We were able to compare the database project to the real database, and then we could even push those changes into GitHub. Now down the road, when a client may call and say, "Oh my God, something's wrong, something's not working," we now have this baseline in our source code control repository that we can compare back to say on the server what is different right now between these 2 points. And as a consultant, I know that can be very helpful to make sure that we can answer questions quickly and get folks back up and running as fast as possible. Hope this is helpful. Thanks for watching.